A lot of people, when they think about the war in Ukraine, they tend to focus on what is happening at the front lines, because they believe that the changes that are happening on the front lines are the most reflective of how the war is actually going. But it turns out that there is actually a far more important battle zone in the war in Ukraine that far fewer people focus on, that is far more impactful for not only who is ultimately going to win the war, but how fast the war will ultimately be won or lost. And this is a battle zone that is going on behind the scenes that is far more impactful than the front lines, because what happens there impacts what happens on the front lines, but also impacts what is going on with every other aspect of the war, including economic. And this other battle zone is also far more impactful because, unlike the front lines, massive changes there are happening every single day. And in fact, in this other battle zone, Ukraine has lately been making gains at perhaps 10 or 20 times or even greater than the rate of gains that Russia is currently making on the actual front lines when it comes to advancing into Ukrainian territory. And if you haven't figured it out yet, what I am talking about is the war of logistics and the war on supply lines that Ukraine and Russia are both waging against each other, and in which Ukraine has made massive, massive strides just over the past week or so. A lot of people have missed it because things are happening just so quickly now. But in the last several weeks, Ukraine has really been ramping up their assaults on Russian territory and strategic targets within Russian territory, particularly against supply lines or munitions factories or things of that sort. And this has happened because the United States has sort of quietly stopped putting pressure on Ukraine when it comes to Ukraine making strikes on Russian territory. A lot of people know that for a long time, the United States and European partners as well put a lot of pressure on Ukraine not to strike targets on Russian territory, but instead to focus on military targets within Ukrainian territory, because striking targets within Russia was seen as provocative, and this was especially true when it came to weapons that were supplied by US or European partners. And that really kind of hamstrung Ukraine's ability to hit strategic targets. And it caused Russia to honestly kind of take that for granted and leave a lot of really important positions rather defenseless. But there has been a change in the United States recently when it comes to President Trump's stance towards Ukraine and Russia in general, with Ukraine now getting a lot more direct and indirect support from the United States. And in particular, one thing that has happened is that the gloves have now sort of come off, and Ukraine is now striking Russian territory with a lot more vigor. And this has, as I said, caused a lot of changes to the Russian supply chain that a lot of people have not noticed directly, but that almost everybody has noticed indirectly. Because it turns out that these supply strikes are causing such massive issues that Russia is now having issues supplying their summer offensive. And this is why, to a large degree, in most positions, the summer offensive seems to have almost been called off, with the Russian troops kind of pulling back and only focusing on a couple of areas. Particularly what we have seen over the past several weeks is Ukraine in particular targeting railway infrastructure, and in particular hubs and critical junctions that lead from areas where supplies are coming from towards the front line, even though this is nowhere near frontline areas that the strikes are actually taking place. So this could be junctions coming out of Moscow and feeding troops in most of Ukraine, or it could be railway lines coming out of Rostov-on-Don and supplying and feeding troops on Crimea. And what it makes it look like is that Ukraine is preparing for something big by preventing Russia from being able to actually get access to resupply itself, so that as Ukraine starves troops on the front lines, victories and make strikes against targets on the front lines, those targets won't have resupplies, and that will allow Ukraine to potentially make some strategic gains in particular areas. However, whether or not Ukraine is actually planning something big, the logistics attacks are very significant in and of themselves. And they're not just important from a logistics standpoint, but they're also important because, as you'll see throughout this video, these attacks are not just hitting the military, but they're also kind of forcing a lot of Russian citizens to feel and experience the actual cost of the war in a way that a lot of them just haven't had to up to this point. As with all things in this war, it starts as a small gap, but it expands over time as the wedge is made, and it can potentially become a cascading flow in combination with a lot of other factors. So with that in mind, let's take a deeper look. First, at a macro level, it will be helpful to set some strategic context so that you can see where these individual strikes that I've just listed out sit in terms of a broader Ukrainian strategy that is extremely effective and that encompasses a whole lot more activity than what I can list off in any one video without you getting bored and just shutting it off. And what you will see is that this is actually extremely fascinating because as we look at the strategic context, what we will realize is also how in so many ways, while the Russian forces think that they are creating history, what is actually happening to them is that they are becoming the victims of history that they failed to adequately study. And so when we talk about the strategic context, it helps to look back at 2 previous wars that Russia has won and that Russia really loves to gloat about, not realizing that they have flipped the strategic context of both of those wars in on itself, and now the strategic forces that help them win those wars are now working against them in this war. You will often hear, for example, Russians gloating about the fact that they are the country that defeated Napoleon and also the country that defeated the Nazis when both of these forces tried to invade the Russian mainland and basically fell victim to long supply chains that they did not adequately prepare for. Both of these armies that entered Russia ultimately fell prey to the 2 biggest advantages that Russia has. First, Russia's massive size, and second, the strongest soldier in the entire Russian military, which is General Winter. This extremely cold, biting Russian winter that really just destroys everything in its path that is not prepared to face it. So Russians will often point to these wars of the past that they ultimately won, really owing more to the terrain than to anything that Russia itself actually did. And they will identify these victories as examples backing up the idea of Russian invincibility, this idea that when Russia goes on the warpath, they cannot actually lose because they defeated such big foes in their past. But what they don't realize is that Ukraine studied their history more than they did. And with these strikes on Russian logistics, Ukraine is now taking advantage of Russia's massive size, which allowed them to win those wars, and using it as a tool against Russia. Where when you have a railway going all the way from Moscow to Ukraine or from Siberia to Ukraine, Ukraine realizes that they do not have to destroy this entire railway to make it ineffective. All they have to do is continuously destroy individual pieces of that railway between the factories that are supplying the materials to the front line and the front line. And as the Russians are repairing that, they can just destroy another piece and basically make it impossible for Russia to get adequate supplies to its troops, whether or not it is able to actually manufacture and produce adequate supplies. They can't actually get those supplies to their troops. And this works just dastardly well, because Russia's biggest advantage in past wars, its size, has now become its biggest disadvantage, owing to 2 major ways that the strategic landscape has changed. First and foremost, what Russia consistently fails to acknowledge when it comes to comparing its past successes to why they will win the current war is that in the past successes, Russia was the defender against forces that were invading Russian territory. But in this war, Russia is the aggressor, and even if Russia won't acknowledge that fact, they at least have to acknowledge that they are the one attacking Ukrainian territory, and therefore they are the one that has to move supplies across all of Russia to get it to its actual target, meaning that they are the one who is vulnerable to the forces of Russian landmass and General Winter. And even more than this, the technological landscape has completely changed to make things even worse than it was in those past 2 wars. Technology has come a long way since Napoleon and Hitler, and in particular, what people can do today that they could not do back then is identify strategic undefended targets from the air, from a distance, without actually having to go there, and then sending a specific munition to hit that specific target. Of course, in Napoleon, this just simply wasn't possible. In World War II, while it was possible to a degree, you couldn't specifically hit the target even if you could identify it from the air. So you had to send large carpet bombing attacks to hit entire cities or entire sectors of cities, or just do massive attacks on an entire area, hoping that you hit maybe the specific railway bridge that you were actually trying to target. But today it's a lot different. Ukraine can get on satellites, they can see imagery of a target, they can send a drone or a precision missile, they can destroy that target and consistently keep Russian infrastructure offline and prevent them from supplying their troops. Now, it's not like Ukraine is the only one doing this. Russia also tries to do this to Ukraine to the degree that it can, and it's often successful. But the biggest problem for Russia in all of this is, again, its massive size, where it is impossible, not virtually impossible, but literally impossible for Russia to control its own airspace because the country is just so large. They do not have enough air defense to do it. And Ukraine, in comparison, has a lot more air defense. And so for Russia to hit targets in Ukrainian territory, what they have to do is send really large waves of drones and overwhelm that air defense. But Ukraine can be a lot more sneaky and a lot more cost effective and simply sneak past it. So this creates a big problem, where in Russia there are soft targets everywhere, far from the front lines, that Ukraine can hit to disrupt Russian supplies. And Russia really can't do anything about that, because if they try to, by perhaps moving air defense systems to areas that were just struck, all that's going to do is open up another vulnerability in a different area, and now Ukraine can strike that area. So Russia really doesn't have a whole lot of tools to work with when it comes to preventing this. Now, even worse for Russia is the design of its rail system itself, which, by the way, I didn't mention earlier, but I should have. But that rail system carries by far the bulk of supplies to the troops on the front line. And by far it outsupplies, for example, vehicles on the ground vehicles, or air transport. And the big problem that Russia has with its rail network is that it was built in Soviet times. And because it was built in Soviet times, like everything else Soviet, it was built with central control in mind, where everything kind of comes from a hub and spoke model so that Moscow could control what comes and goes from that railway a lot more easily. But because of this centralized hub and spoke model that the rail system has, it makes the rail system extremely predictable. You know exactly which rail lines go from which cities to ultimately reach the front line in Ukraine. And you really have no alternate routes. What are you going to do? Just build another railroad overnight while you're at war and you already have a massive labor shortage? That's not going to work. And so Russia really can't, take an alternate supply route to try to stop this problem either. Instead, Ukraine can just continually take advantage of incredibly predictable, incredibly lengthy supply routes, and again, make it impossible for the supplies to reach the front lines. So what Russia will have to contend with from now on until the war ends is basically a game of whack-a-mole. And it's a game of whack-a-mole where if you've played an arcade version of this, the moles are going to start coming up faster as the game progresses, and you're going to get increasingly tired and have a harder time hitting them. And eventually you're going to get overwhelmed. And that's how it's going to be for Russia as they try to keep up and protect their supply routes, to keep their troops supplied in the front lines. And if they cannot keep their troops supplied in the front lines, eventually those front lines will have to break, or at the very least, they will have to stop assaulting Ukraine, and it will be impossible for Russia to make gains on Ukrainian territory. And it won't matter if Russia is able to recruit every soldier in the world. It won't matter if Russia is able to procure supplies from North Korea or China or Iran. It won't matter if Russia is able to manufacture things themselves and have totally adequate supplies somewhere within Russia. If all of those people and if all of that material cannot reach the front line in adequate quantities to actually carry out an offensive. But more than that, this game of whack-a-mole and these same underlying vulnerabilities are also causing another problem in Russia that I mentioned early in this video. which is that now for the first time, a lot of Russian citizens are having to contend with the cost of the war in a way that they never actually thought about, which is because of a thing that a lot of you have heard about, which is air traffic delays that are now hitting Russia on almost a nightly basis, basically paralyzing air traffic throughout Russia and causing a lot of Russian citizens to be stuck within various cities far away from home. Now, I used to think this wasn't really that big of a deal, but then as I started to think about it more, I realized just how impactful these regular airport closures really are when it comes to Russian society. Because imagine in your country if you had a relative who was stuck in an airport for 3 days or 5 days and couldn't move, and you figured out that the underlying cause of that was a war that your country was in. That up to this point, you hadn't really thought much about that war because your government had made it so you didn't. This brings the war front and center to the minds of a lot of Russian people for the first time. And yes, while Ukraine has had to contend with these airport closures, for most of the war, they really haven't had air traffic going over Ukraine for most of the war. The fundamental difference is that Ukraine knows it's in a defensive war, and they know that this is done to protect them from the enemy that is trying to attack them. For Russian citizens, they have been told for a long time that the Russian government totally has control of the situation and things are totally safe. And a lot of them are realizing that that's not true. And they're starting to realize, well, maybe this war is not something that I want my country to be involved in, especially as the aggressor. And the thing is, Russia really can't do anything, just like the railway strikes, to prevent the airport closures. Because Russian airspace is just so big, when there is a big Ukrainian drone assault and it hits a lot of different Russian cities, Russia can't predict exactly what's going on, and that's what makes them forced to close their airspace in the first place. And they are trying to solve this by moving air defense systems from the front lines to protect actual civilian airspace from Ukrainian drones. And again, this leads to that game of whack-a-mole that I already spoke about, where it creates more holes somewhere else because Russia does not have unlimited air defense. So in all aspects of Russian society, when it comes to their logistics, whether that is logistics supplying their soldiers on the front line, or moms simply trying to get home from a business trip or a holiday weekend, Ukraine has crippled Russia logistically. And their ability to do that is increasing, not decreasing in any way. Now, finally, this is fundamentally sustainable because for Ukraine, the way that they are carrying out all these logistics strikes is highly asymmetric when it comes to the cost. It is far cheaper for Ukraine to do the destruction than it is for Russia to do the repairs or to try to protect themselves against further destruction. When you can have a drone that costs several $1,000s destroy a railway that can lock up supplies from going through a particular area for a matter of weeks or months or even just days, that is a massive cost for Russia and a very small cost for Ukraine. And the cost is larger than just not getting supplies to the front. The cost also means bogging up all of the facilities that are behind that facility that are trying to deliver supplies to the front. Because if a factory is supplying troops to Russian soldiers, but they have no ability to send those supplies down the rail lines, eventually they're going to not be able to produce supplies anymore. And that is going to cause production bottlenecks for Russia as well. And that's a huge problem because already as it is, they're not able to produce enough for their soldiers. So they're going to have these gaps where they're not able to get supplies to their soldiers. And because of the bottlenecks those create, eventually those soldiers will not have enough gear either. So all in all, this is a really great step for Ukraine. Really bad news for Russia. If you learned something from this video, consider supporting the channel. Become a channel member, a patron, buy me a coffee. All of it helps keep supporting this work so that I can continue doing this research and providing videos like this for you guys to watch. Thanks so much for watching. Check out one of these videos for the next one.